kind of a mashup of two different projects, two different papers. But the context for both is the emergence of AI as the new frontier technology, and cloud computing as the kind of, in particular, as the kind of foundational infrastructure on which this entire AI ecosystem is being built. So here's a kind of overview of the talk. I'm going to talk through the first paper, which came out in December, and which focuses mostly, and both of these projects, by the way, are with a wonderful, wonderful graduate student and colleague of mine, J.S. Tan, who's actually in the Urban Studies Department at MIT. So the first paper came out in December, and it focuses mostly on the US. And in that paper, we trace the origins of the cloud business model, and we try to highlight the ways in which this new model really differs from the platform business model out of which it basically grew. And we use that analysis as a kind of jumping off point for exploring some of the political and also distributional implications of these developments. And then I'll turn to some more preliminary thoughts from a second paper, again with J.S. Tan. This is very much work in progress, so we're really interested to hear your thoughts on this. But this is more of an effort to characterize and explain cross-national variation in the way these technologies are developing, and especially these ways are diffusing in Europe, China, and the United States. So I just want to start by kind of reminding you of some of the core features of the platform business model that rose to dominance in the 1990s and early 2000s, and that at the time were very much at the forefront of this new quote-unquote knowledge economy. So stylizing very radically and simplifying a great deal, the big platform firms of this period, the Ubers, the Googles, the Facebooks, Amazon, et cetera, they shared a number of kind of core characteristics, right? First, they were famously asset light. Many of these firms weren't really producing anything at all, anything tangible at all. They were earning rents instead through licensing their patents or their designs, like Apple, or companies like Amazon or Google. They were making money by basically leveraging their role as intermediaries in these two-sided markets that they themselves were creating, linking buyers and sellers, creators and viewers, or workers and employers. Related to that, traditional platform firms are extremely hierarchically organized, right? They have a few kind of very high skill, very well-paid engineers at some fancy headquarters someplace, but the actual work is, of course, done by a bunch of subcontractors and precariously employed workers much further down the chain. Third, most of the big platform firms were and are, catering to consumers in these kind of winner-take-all markets, right? First movers have huge advantages because of the importance of network effects, right? The goal is to lock in a huge number of users who are willing to pay for the services that you offer, in large part with the data that you're sharing with them. And then finally, for platform firms, data is really the coin of the realm. That's the key to market dominance. The more data you have, the more you can refine your algorithm, you can enhance user engagement, and form this kind of self-reinforcing cycle. So that's an economy that is, of course, still very much with us. But in our work, JS and I are trying to draw attention to a new cloud business model that has grown up really alongside and in many ways out of this platform model, and that really represents the new frontier in the knowledge economy. So the shift in the business model has been kind of hard to see because most of the names of some of the key companies here are the same. Right? The three big players here are Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, which together control, as you see here, over 60% of the global market in cloud services. But the thing is, the center of gravity within each of these companies has really shifted. Right? Amazon is still, of course, doing e-commerce, but the real growth, the real investment is in the cloud division, AWS. And with AWS, it's doing very different things. It's doing things like developing the AI models for, say, car manufacturers to run their predictive maintenance systems or to, do their crash simulations. Same thing for Microsoft. Microsoft is, of course, still selling Office Suite to its corporate and individual consumer clients. But the real action, again, is in the cloud division, Azure, which is providing IT infrastructure for things like fraud detection in banks and airlines. So the basic business model of the cloud is to provide IT infrastructure as a service. So cloud computing in many ways operates like any other subscription service. It provides a way for customers to rent, in this case, to rent servers rather than purchase them, right? So in the kind of olden days, by which I mean like 15 years ago, companies ran their own IT systems from their own physical computers. They were responsible for their own networking. They were responsible for their own storage, et cetera. But now that company or these companies can outsource their IT infrastructure to these cloud providers and digitally rent those services through the internet. So what these firms are doing is they're basically aggregating and pooling demand across a bunch of different clients with different usage patterns, and so that this shared infrastructure can be running at like closer to full capacity at all times. And then they're passing the cost and efficiency savings on to their clients. So from the perspective of client firms, there are a couple of big advantages to this. The first is that you just avoid the headache, you avoid the cost of operating and maintaining your own servers, all those hardware components that you saw on the previous slide, the cooling systems, the IT technicians that you need to maintain these systems. So that's one big advantage. The second big advantage is flexibility. Right, this is like computing capacity on tap. You can dial up or dial down as you need it. So it's kind of a pay-as-you-go system so that you can avoid these heavy capital investments that you would need to have your own on-premise capacity. So that's great. And that's also and especially great for these platform firms who, of course, want to stay asset light, right? They don't want all of that capital infrastructure. It's also, the cloud also provided the infrastructure on which a whole bunch of very light startups actually first launched their businesses. So this figure just basically shows you how firms have been moving away from investing in their own infrastructure, that's kind of the light bars here, toward increasingly in favor of moving to the cloud. That's these dark bars. And actually, unfortunately, this figure only goes to 2021, but of course this trend has continued, and indeed it's accelerated massively. So at first, those cloud providers were just providing this kind of core IT infrastructure, that firms could rent, right? Just those three components that were on the earlier slide. And basically, they were offering this as a kind of standardized commodity. Now, that's a pretty low value-added service, which also means that the margins on that are pretty low. So initially, there were a lot more firms in this space. But in like the early to mid 2010s, you had some very intense price competition that squeezed a lot of the smaller providers out. And I put a few of the kind of casualties of those price wars on the screen here. So this is the period when you saw the consolidation of this industry around these three dominant companies. This is when we begin to get this very oligopolistic structure. So the firms that won out in those price wars then began to move upmarket, offering their clients, sort of higher value-added services. And why are they doing this? They're doing this to increase rents through customization. And so this involved working with software firms to begin to offer and build industry or even task-specific applications on top of that kind of core foundational infrastructure. So AWS, providing cloud services for Netflix to drive recommendations to users based on ongoing real-time machine learning, for example, or Microsoft's Azure providing Exxon with the IT infrastructure that it needed to run these AI models for, say, gas and oil exploration. So this move up market calls for tighter coupling between software and hardware, and actually to produce the most, the most specialized services for particular clients. That actually requires a lot of compute and a lot of coordination between the software and the hardware. And so this is what you see in this Microsoft blog post where they're saying, our chips nestle into custom server boards placed within tailor-made racks that fit easily inside existing Microsoft data centers. The hardware will work hand in hand with the software, co-designed together to unlock new capabilities and opportunities. So that's what they're pitching now. So a lot of that first paper was devoted to highlighting the ways in which this new cloud business model is really very different from the kind of traditional platform business model out of which it grew. I put the key differences on the screen here, and I'm going to go through each of them quickly. So the first difference is, where traditional platform firms were famously asset light, these cloud firms are extremely asset heavy, right? Data is still important, but it's really not the key to dominance. The crucial competitive resource for cloud service providers is compute. That is the physical infrastructure that's needed to train and run specialized workloads for individual corporate clients on increasingly dedicated computing resources. So the top three firms in this area, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, those three firms alone invested over $300 billion just last year in data centers, and they're, of course, on track to spend a whole lot more than that this year as well. They're also making huge investments in energy sources, nuclear, geothermal, wind, and solar. And so this figure is just showing you how the CapEx, the capital expenditure for all three of these firms really took off right at the moment that each one of them adopted the cloud business model. The second difference is a shift from domination over to kind of collaboration with partner firms. So traditional platform firms were characterized and are characterized by relationships of extreme hierarchy and even domination, right? Apple completely sets the terms of its partnerships with the hardware producers that are actually producing its devices. Or Uber is, of course, completely setting the terms for these, quote unquote, partner drivers who are actually doing the work. But by contrast, the relationship between the cloud service providers and their suppliers and their other partners is really quite different. It's less asymmetric in terms of power, and in many cases, it's characterized by extremely high degrees of mutual dependence. So, as I mentioned, there's tight coupling between hardware and software is increasingly important, and particularly for the most specialized applications, for the most sophisticated applications for particular clients, you need both the most advanced frontier models and the most sophisticated hardware, right? Cloud providers don't own every layer of the stack, so you get a more modular kind of organization and even sort of semi-vertical integration with partner firms. So this figure is just giving you an example of what this looks like for Microsoft. Microsoft has its own in-house capabilities at various layers of the so-called stack. That's what you see in blue here. But mostly they're relying very heavily on their partnership with these other firms, which is what you see in the kind of gray. And those relationships are, of course, they're a mix of collaboration and codependence, but among really equally powerful partners. OpenAI and Microsoft are both really powerful companies, but OpenAI needs Microsoft's Azure or another cloud provider to train and run its models, right? And Microsoft, in turn, needs OpenAI, partly because its own models are certainly not, at this point, anywhere near as powerful. And everybody wants to partner with NVIDIA because at this point, NVIDIA's semiconductors, their GPUs, have really become the kind of cornerstone of AI development. These patterns then of codependence are also what lie behind these kind of very complicated financial relationships among the firms in this ecosystem that you may be reading about. This is just a figure from Bloomberg, which is showing these kind of circular deals among these various companies with chip makers like NVIDIA and other partners. So finally, these patterns of codependence, as well, finally, the final sort of difference is that platform firms are mostly consumer-facing, right? The business model involved developing pretty superficial relationship with millions, maybe tens of millions of individual consumers, but cloud firms are much more enterprise-facing. So rather than selling a kind of standardized service to millions of individual consumers, what they want to do is they want to develop long-term relationships with a much smaller number of very large, ideally Fortune 500 corporations like Bank of America or Walmart by offering them very specialized, often bespoke cloud services. And this is what this graph is meant to illustrate. At this point, it's really a pretty small group of the largest companies that accounts for most of the cloud spending. So those cloud clients have very specific, very complex needs. And so keeping them happy is really crucial because that's going to tell you how much they're willing to spend on the cloud. So for cloud providers, that means developing pretty intimate familiarity with your own corporate client operations, and getting ongoing feedback from these clients in order to be able to, in an ongoing way, build new services and new products that can meet their needs. This is referred to as the firm's so-called absorptive capacity. So these cloud firms have their own sales teams, they have these customer care departments, and in some cases a corporate client will be so important to the company that they'll have their own people literally sitting in the client firm. And so this is what you have Google sort of advertising here. It's saying, we collaborate with our specialists to work alongside you to understand your business goals and help you on your cloud journey forward. Sometimes what they also do actually is partner with enterprise service firms like SAP that already have really deep domain knowledge in a particular industry and that are able to help kind of traditional legacy corporate clients migrate to the cloud, basically. So even though we're talking about a really tiny number of firms, we think these developments are hugely important because these are the firms that are both kind of the key enablers of AI development, but they're also really, certainly in the US, the primary vehicles through which AI is diffusing throughout the economy. So the implications of this are still very much emerging, but at this point, JS and I think that there is enough to, that a couple of things at least have been coming into view. And I'll talk about each of these. The first is new political dynamics and the emergence of what we're calling a new techno-nationalist alliance. So these asset-light platform firms of the past, they could engage in all kinds of regulatory arbitrage. They could move their operations around in order to avoid tax liability or whatever. Mostly what they wanted was the government, was for the government just to leave them alone. But these cloud firms actually have made huge investments in what are really immovable assets. And they also have huge contracts with the government. This is a very lucrative source of income for them. And so on multiple dimensions, these firms are just a lot more vulnerable to government regulation. And we think that this has created enormous material incentives for them to really curry favor with national policymakers. And with very few exceptions, I think this is exactly what we're seeing. So this is, of course, this famous tableau from the Trump administration where these tech executives, many of whom had been extremely critical of Trump, were now lined up behind him at the inauguration. And we can talk about the extent to which the Anthropics kind of fight with the Department of Defense or the Department of War now, whether that signals more distance. But at the end of the day, really, the big cloud providers all are still very heavily involved with the government. And I think Marianne could tell us a lot about that as well. So the dependence, though, runs in both directions, right? The government also increasingly relies on these cloud providers. So a firm like Palantir, which is running basically all of the data analytics for the US military, it's also running all the analytics for these ICE operations, and which is now kind of terrifyingly in conversations with the Social Security Administration. They don't have their own data centers. They are partnering with these big three cloud providers, plus actually Oracle, which is kind of in fourth place. But more generally, basically, the government sees the cloud and these firms as kind of crucial to winning this so-called AI arms race with China. And so this is why I put the Trump executive order up there. This was really a priority. This has been a priority for really both political parties, but with this new executive order, Trump is really doubling down and has removed all of the, anyway, extremely light regulations that the Biden administration had been trying to place on these firms. So basically, you're getting a very deep integration of extremely concentrated corporate power and now combined with state power. We also think these developments have really important distributional consequences, and we think in particular they're likely to entrench industry incumbents in an economy that's already characterized by extreme levels of concentration. This is something that Thomas Philippon has pointed out, which is why I put his book on the screen there. The big platform firms of 20 years ago, they kind of came in from left field and really disrupted traditional industries, right? So, Airbnb came in from the outside and totally reconfigured or disrupted the hotel industry. Amazon came in again from outside and really reconfigured the retail industry. But these cloud providers now give industry incumbents a lot more tools to stave off that kind of competition. So it's the biggest firms like Walmart. They're the ones with the resources that are able to integrate all of these new cloud services. And so we expect that this cloud business model is, if anything, going to deepen inequality and, if anything, going to really intensify concentration, again, in an economy that's already characterized by very high levels of oligopolistic control in many industries. Finally, this kind of concentration of power is, of course, nowhere more evident than in the cloud sector itself. We have this tiny handful of firms that have become really critical hubs in the economy because they are providing the IT infrastructure on which firms really across the entire economy are relying. So traditional manufacturing firm like John Deere, they're using AI for things like predictive maintenance, very central to their current operations. But John Deere doesn't have its own data centers. Like other manufacturers, they are relying on one of these cloud providers. Same thing in services. Citibank. Citibank has some of its own proprietary data centers, but because of the increasing demands of AI, which are getting incorporated into Citibank's operations, they too are increasingly migrating to the cloud. In the case of Citibank, I think it's mostly Google Cloud. So basically, the sheer reach of this handful of cloud providers into all corners of the economy make them an incredibly important node, or what Abe Newman and Henry Farrell call a choke point in the economy. And so just to give you an example of what this means in practice, in October, AWS had an outage that reverberated extremely widely. And this is just actually a partial list of the companies that were affected. So it's Amazon, Venmo, Hulu, McDonald's, Zoom, Lloyd's Bank, WhatsApp. So we're talking about a really incredible concentration of power. And we think that this is just a development that requires a lot more scrutiny and a lot more research. Okay, so what I've been talking about until now is basically all on the US, but there's clearly a general drive to promote the cloud and AI in other countries as well. And so in this second paper, JS and I are turning our attention to the question of how these processes are unfolding in the US, China, and Europe. These are the three regions in which cloud infrastructure and AI in general are most diffused and most advanced. So if you're following the commentary, especially in the trade press or in the media, you will know that there's just this kind of obsession with the race to AGI, artificial general intelligence, this kind of super powerful, super intelligent model that's going to be able to improve upon itself. And depending on who you talk to, it'll either bring some kind of utopia or the apocalypse. But the really intense focus on AGI, which is like this small circle in the diagram, we think in some ways this is drawing our attention away from all the more industry and task-specific forms of AI. All of these forms of AI that I've been talking about, all these bigger circles, that are very much alive. And at this point, that's what's diffusing. These are the forms of AI that are diffusing throughout the economy, and not just in the US, but again, in other countries as well. So in this second paper, JS and I are turning to the question of how those processes have been unfolding differently cross-nationally. So a lot of the way that people talk about this is in terms of like which countries are ahead, which countries are behind. And if you take almost any of the conventional measures, whether you're talking about the number of data centers or just the revenue generated by cloud, the US is just way out ahead. China's in second place, and Europe is a kind of distant third. But we think that this way of thinking about cross-national variation may be missing a much more important story, which is really more about different patterns of diffusion across these cases. And these are differences that we see not so much as differences in degree, but differences in kind. So to appreciate this point, I first need to refer back to the couple of ways that the cloud can be used that I started flagging earlier. So one way, as I mentioned, kind of the most basic way, is just firms renting servers from cloud providers rather than operating and maintaining their own IT infrastructure. So basically, this is what I was talking about when I was talking about cloud as a kind of standardized commodity service. So in the industry, this kind of basic service is referred to as IaaS, infrastructure as a service. So this is what McKinsey calls using the cloud to rejuvenate, but if you look at what they mean by that, it's basically just pointing to those cost and flexibility advantages that I mentioned earlier. But the other way the cloud is being used is with all those more specialized, higher value added services that I was talking about. So basically creating new services and new applications on top of that kind of core infrastructure layer. This is what McKinsey refers to as using the cloud to innovate, because these additional services are allowing client firms to do things that simply wouldn't be possible without the cloud. And in the industry, this is these kind of higher value added services, that's referred to as platform as a service, or PaaS. Just to give you a concrete example of this, if you're a traditional animation studio, you could simply rent a bunch of servers or a few servers on the cloud. But if you really want to innovate and do really new things, you could use the cloud to spin up hundreds, even thousands of servers on a very short-term basis, distribute this rendering task quickly across all of them, a big cluster of services, each doing a particular piece of the job, and then stitch it all back together again in seconds, right? And that is a very complex technical task. It's extremely compute intensive, but it's something that cloud providers can basically do for you. So basically this lets artists iterate and produce far more sophisticated output or content than they would be able to do on their own. So if we look at different countries in terms of how firms are actually using the cloud based on that basic, fairly crude distinction, we can see that the cross-national variation looks a lot different. Firms in Europe and the US are much more heavily invested in these higher value-added PaaS services, that's the light gray here, while Chinese companies, at this point certainly, are mostly using the cloud for these more commodity level services, IaaS. So what drives those differences? JS and I are pointing to three factors. First is the nature of the cloud providers. The second is the nature of the existing and potential client base. And the third is the all-important relationship between the two. And a lot of this comes out of the literature on innovation. So the first thing that's important is the cloud providers. Past this higher value added stuff, that requires very resource-rich cloud providers that have both this big capital infrastructure and also the engineering talent that you need to run these extremely complex workloads. Second, the client firms themselves have to be technically sophisticated. If they don't understand what's possible from a technical perspective, they simply cannot articulate their needs. And third, this really important factor of the nature of the relationship between cloud providers and their client firms, this issue of absorptive capacity that I was referring to earlier. Basically, without a very deep understanding of your client's workflows, cloud providers simply don't know what to build. So you really need all three of these components. And it turns out that there are very significant differences across different countries or regions in terms of those three factors. And this, we think, is why each of these regions or countries has the particular cloud profile that it does. So I'll go through them quickly. The US, I've already talked a lot about the basics here. The first and most obvious factor is that the US does have these preeminent cloud providers, these extremely capital-rich, so-called hyperscalers, and they have all these data centers and very deep engineering talent. But what the US also has is a large and very sophisticated client base. So many of the early cloud customers were exactly these tech startups that really launched their operations on the cloud. And of course, they are full of these sophisticated engineers who are always kind of pushing forward on what you can do on the cloud. But in addition to all these startups, you also have a big swath of very large firms like JP Morgan or Walmart that are already so-called cloud ready in the sense that they're already spending a lot on IT, and they're already, they already have a whole stable of very technically sophisticated engineers. So the U.S. basically has sophisticated players on both the supply and the demand side. And in addition, the U.S. has this well-developed professional services ecosystem, firms like Accenture, Deloitte, and those are the firms that can help these traditional legacy companies migrate to the cloud, or at least articulate their needs to the cloud service providers so that the cloud service providers can build what they need. China has some similarities with the US. Its top cloud providers are also very sophisticated. They also actually come out of the platform era. In fact, Huawei already launched a cloud a year actually before AWS, and they offer cloud services, Alibaba, Tencent also. But in addition, the Chinese government has been very involved in promoting cloud computing, particularly since 2016. And so basically, the way that they've done it has kind of followed the traditional playbook for Chinese industrial policy. Beijing kind of signals what the priority sectors are and then promotes competition within them. So in the cloud sector, that means you have state-owned enterprises in telecoms that have moved into this space, among other things, to compete with the big internet giants. You also have local governments that have kind of raced in to support domestic cloud providers through subsidies, preferential loans, cheap land, etc. So that approach has produced a very significant cloud sector, but state policy has tended to channel cloud capabilities toward cost reduction at this commodity infrastructure level, right? And that has, of course, a lot to do with the demand side. China's export profile they have a lot of firms that have been traditionally competing on price. So in cloud, a lot of the emphasis has been on process innovation, right? To help client firms kind of optimize internal processes to keep costs down or to drive costs down so that they can make their products more cheaply or or more efficiently. And so we think that this helps explain China's cloud profile, why it's so dominated by these lower level infrastructure IaaS services, which is great for process innovation for all the reasons that McKinsey talked about in that earlier slide, but it's just far less conducive to the move into these higher value added services. And so partly as a result of this, Chinese cloud providers have actually been sort of stuck in a kind of a price competition cycle over the cost of their infrastructure services. The US had a kind of price war too, but it was resolved very quickly, whereas in China, this thing has really dragged on much longer. And so basically, the Chinese story is you get a cloud sector that's large, it's fast growing, it's infrastructure heavy, but it's disproportionately kind of concentrated in that lower IaaS segment. So Europe is interesting because its cloud profile is similar to the US, actually, on this dimension. It's also very PaaS heavy. It's sort of heavy on these heavy value-added services. But the really defining feature of the European cloud sector is just that it's much smaller. Right? There are European cloud providers, OVH, Stackit, Scaleway in particular, a couple of others, but each of them is simply a whole lot smaller than the US hyperscalers. And as a consequence of that, they also have a far less comprehensive portfolio of services that they can offer their client firms. So if we bring back this revenue chart from before, which is what's on the left again, this is just from previous, we can see that even the top EU countries are just really barely contenders in the cloud space. Nevertheless, what you see on the right is that in terms of demand, the demand for cloud is extremely high in Europe. It's actually second only to North America at 27% in terms of the total market for cloud. And why is that? That's because you have a whole bunch of very sophisticated client firms in automobiles, in pharma, in precision machinery, and they're very eager to take advantage of the cloud and AI. So you have auto manufacturers, for example, they need this really intensive, complex compute-heavy, compute-intensive stuff for say crash simulations, and these are the firms in these traditional sectors that have deep domain knowledge, they have engineering talent, and they also have the financial resources to sometimes take a risk on integrating what are still, in some cases, quite untested capabilities into their production processes. So in Europe, you have a kind of mismatch between local supply of cloud services and demand for these services. And what that has meant is that European client firms are almost entirely dependent on US providers. And that dependence has, if anything, increased over the years. That's what you see on the left. And what you see on the right is that those top 3 American hyperscalers are capturing the lion's share of demand for cloud in Europe. So this has obviously triggered a whole lot of hand-wringing in Europe, particularly in the light of Trump's rather erratic behavior toward Europe. And it's also brought about a kind of hard pivot away from Europe's kind of traditional emphasis on trying to regulate foreign firms. Think about Data Markets Act or Data Services Act, and what you're now getting in Europe is increasingly urgent calls for action to pursue what they're calling digital sovereignty. So Europeans and the EU in particular kind of want to drive diffusion through European providers. So Europe there have been some Europe-wide efforts. Gaia-X, right, or maybe it's Gaia-X, is this kind of consortium between European cloud firms and client firms to coordinate on data security, but also to coordinate on things like interoperability. You also have the idea of a Euro stack that is full European ownership of all layers of the stack. But all of these initiatives have really run into big political problems, including a lot of differences across different actors in terms of how they want to define what digital sovereignty actually consists of. There's also continued ambivalence about how to deal with these American hyperscalers. For example, Gaia X, there was a big conflict within Gaia X over like whether they should let American firms even join this consortium. So AWS did join the consortium, at which point France's Scaleway, which is one of the bigger European cloud providers, they left. So in the meantime, all of these eager client corporations have no real incentive to wait for all of this stuff to kind of play out. And so they've been basically deepening their partnership and their dependence on American providers. So in the meantime, basically what you have is all the major American hyperscalers have created these new kind of sovereign cloud offerings for their European clients. Basically, they're kind of siloing their European subsidiaries, offering various kinds of technical solutions to kind of keep data local, to beef up encryption, to make sure that only Europeans can control these things through various kinds of access controls. Microsoft has promised to put its data center source code in a vault under a mountain in Switzerland. So you're getting all sorts of kind of promises to preserve data security in Europe. But paradoxically, the fact that so much of the conversation about sovereignty in Europe has centered on privacy has kind of perversely further entrenched American hyperscalers because they're the ones that are really better positioned to make the kinds of technical adjustments that are really necessary to meet these high standards for privacy, right? Basically, American firms can kind of outcomply their smaller European competitors. For local entrants, if anything, these very strict requirements have turned out to look more like a kind of additional barrier to entry. A related development in Europe involves incumbent firms or industries like autos or pharma, kind of working closely with American partners, often with EU or state funding, to kind of build sector-specific cloud solutions. So, for example, in Germany, Siemens has been partnering, which builds software for manufacturing. They've partnered with major telecoms providers to develop what they're calling an industrial AI cloud for German manufacturing. Or Google has teamed up with Deutsche Telekom to provide cloud services for German companies. So as the European level solutions have been stuck, you basically are getting a lot of bilateral deals that have been taking shape in the absence of a real, truly European alternative to the US hyperscalers. So this is just kind of a summary of the argument. Basically, the US has both the sophisticated cloud sector and the sophisticated client base. China has the cloud sector, but not the cloud-ready client base, at least not to the same extent. And Europe kind of has the opposite of that. And I'm going to apologize for this. This is the final slide, and I'm going to apologize that it's a little bit dense. But I just want to conclude by emphasizing that the diffusion of the cloud is really not, or AI is not automatic. It's not simply a matter of how good the technology is or even how much political support lies behind it. It depends a lot on the characteristics of the broader political economy in each country. And that is why I think we have these distinctive profiles. And what I want to say with this slide is that these profiles in many ways align in a kind of varieties of capitalism way with features of the political economy within which this diffusion is really taking place. So the US is getting broad and deep diffusion led in many ways by the cloud firms themselves, which have been given extremely free rein because of the US's extremely permissive regulatory landscape. And so here AI is diffusing pretty widely in firms across a wide range of sectors that are using the cloud to generate all these new services, new products, et cetera. China, the state is playing a much more active role. So you have very broad diffusion But because of China's traditional emphasis on low-cost exports, a lot of this has focused on these more basic process innovation, and therefore it's had an overall less dramatic impact in terms of the organizational transformations that is occurring in the within the firms, the user firms themselves. And then Europe has this third pattern where it's industry incumbents, actually, who are playing a big role. They're, in fact, if anything, playing the leading role in cloud diffusion. And the cloud is really being adapted to their needs. So in Europe, you have kind of broad, well, you have deep, but actually quite uneven diffusion, a lot of uptake in certain industries, but based largely on this continued dependence on the American hyperscalers. So thanks. Steve.
Fantastic talk. So I think the first and second pieces fit really nicely together. And I noticed how, as you were kind of starting to talk about the second part, you started to talk in terms of three distinct cases. And I think that you kind of ended on that way. But when you were talking about the US and Europe, it became very clear that they really aren't distinct cases. That I guess what I'm getting at is that even though obviously I'm a lover of comparative political economy approaches, that this particular project might require more focus on the interactions among the three parts. So that if you think about like the platform model and then the cloud model really initiating in the United States, that means that developments in Europe and China are reactions to that. So like if we take competitive logic, that's not just like coming out of the domestic institutions, that's a reaction to a particular US primacy in a particular area. And obviously China and Europe respond to it very differently. So I guess my question is whether you think you might want to explore that more, and if so, how you would do it.
Yeah, they're not three sort of completely independent cases, and everybody is kind of responding to or adapting to the U.S. lead in this area. Yeah, I'm not sure how to. Maybe you have ideas about how to incorporate that. I mean, it's clear in the case of Europe because they're really just operating with the American companies, and the Chinese case they're developing it internally, but using it very differently, or they're leaning into different parts of how to use the cloud. I think we do have to think more about that, especially in this kind of current geopolitical context, because that's actually what's driving. I mean, until recently, Europe was perfectly, I don't know if they were happy to, but they were just sort of settling on trying to regulate the American companies in a stricter way. And if anything, the fact that Europe was doing this regulation on Data Markets Act, Data Services Act, if anything, it had spillover effects in the United States, like in a different way. We don't have GDPR in the way that they have it in Europe, but we certainly have stronger. There's the possibility of stronger controls just because of a California effect, right? Google's making the product for the globe, and therefore they have features that they can turn on and off depending on different contexts. And so the whole sovereignty thing is really an effort to like have a more radical break with that. I will say that the coalition to try to do that is not clear. Partly for the reason that I was talking about, like different countries have different ideas about what relationship they want with the US and with regulation of tech in general. And so Ireland and some of these countries are very like light touch, whereas France and other countries they really want to regulate this stuff much more stringently. So there's those cross-national differences. But honestly, the other thing is that all these client firms and all these startups that are kind of existentially reliant on American hyperscalers, they are not part of this. They're not part of a coalition that wants to have any kind of a radical break with the U.S. on this stuff. And, while they could migrate over to, a European alternative, to the extent that that alternative right now is very uncertain and very sort of fragile and not, and actually like cannot provide the same portfolio of services, even if they, even if they could, there's a kind of like lock-in effect. And so putting a coalition together to really lean into full, like full sovereignty in this area as a political problem is really tough, actually. And so that's part of what's, I think, going on. So, the cloud providers in Europe would love it, but all these client firms are kind of locked in already to the American system. So that's why you get all these promises about sovereignty, and actually they charge a premium for all of that as well, of course, so they make money both ways. Yeah. Yes, with the sweater around you. Yeah.
Thank you. That was that was interesting, and I was particularly interested in your kind of comparing, your comparative analysis, how things have evolved in U.S., China, and Europe, and the factors that you sort of attribute the differences to. My question for you is, to what extent do you think that the nature of the enterprise is also a key factor, in the sense that, here in the United States, we moved pretty quickly from infrastructure outsourcing to, the platform as a service. Suddenly you had old line enterprises, Kimberly Clark, right? They make diapers. Fine, they outsourced their infrastructure, but very quickly then outsourced finance, outsourced HR, outsourced procurement. And that required a pretty basic transformation in the nature of the enterprise. I mean, it's like no longer were corporations sort of defined as what existed within this boundary. We moved towards something that I'd more appropriately characterize as an extended enterprise, where you have certain functions still happening within the enterprise, but much of the action is happening beyond the four corners of the enterprise. That sort of evolution, I don't think, well, it's been much slower in Europe, and in China, I think it's probably not, I don't know. But that's my question to you. To what extent does sort of the nature of the enterprise and the enterprise's ability to quickly evolve, with the help of the Accentures and all these other, smart people helping you figure out how to transform to, be more competitive in this evolving economy. But to what extent does the nature of the enterprise kind of play into what you've so nicely discussed here?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with whether they have, moving away from the platform model, which is like outsource everything and just keep the sort of core things, but thinking about it from the perspective of the cloud. I think the really big difference is between firms that have the kind of the resources and the technical expertise to be able to articulate what their needs would be to a cloud provider. So for example, that's part of the issue. I mean, I learned all of this from my colleague JS about China, but a lot of traditional firms in China are not even digitized. You have to be digitized in order to even start thinking about moving to the cloud. But even banks, so state-owned banks in China are just not as sophisticated. They just don't have the level of technical expertise that they would need in order to migrate to the cloud. Whereas J.P. Morgan, pre-cloud had all of this expertise. They had their own data centers, et cetera, and so they were kind of in a position to imagine the ways in which the cloud could help them by allowing them to shed this infrastructure and to do much more complicated things via the cloud than they would be able to do on their on-prem, as they say, on-premise infrastructure. So I think a lot of it has to do with whether or not you have the engineering talent and the resources to be able to move to the cloud. And that's where these firms like Accenture and Deloitte come in, because they're the ones that are helping kind of legacy firms figure out what it is that they could do differently on the cloud by outsourcing their infrastructure needs to cloud providers in that way. And that's actually I think a big difference. Europe has that in droves, but the U.S. has that, but China has that in less prevalently, I guess. I mean, in the startup sector, they have it for sure, but in sort of traditional industries, not as much. So,
Thank you for your amazing talk. I really appreciate that. My question is, because I'm a Chinese student, and actually with a dual background from the United States and China, I think that because both the United States and China, they want to win the AI race, and in this way, they will have maybe less attention on the AI regulation. But I think the Europe country, they pay more attention on the AI regulation, and the regulation there will be maybe far more strict than American China. And I know that in China, even the government itself is one part of the components in this race. And my question is, do you think that the very strong AI regulation will stifle the innovation? And how can we balance between the AI development and also maybe the human dignity and the regulation part? Is my question.
yeah, that is a really great question, and it's one that is being intensively debated within Europe. Because there is a whole, like there's a famous report, Draghi report on European integration that's all about like, what's the problem with innovation in Europe? And there are a bunch of people in Europe working on this, including David Soskas and Michael Storper and others, which really think that over-regulation has been inhibiting the development of the cloud and AI in general. And so whereas in the US, it's kind of like a let it rip environment where, if these firms are extremely lightly regulated, really not regulated at all. And, I don't know that maybe Marianne has an answer to this that would be better than mine, but I'm just not sure that they've got quite the diagnosis right. There has to be a way to sort of reconcile these privacy concerns with the concerns for like wanting to promote innovation. And so, I mean, a lot of this new AI, there's a new AI Act in Europe, which lists a whole bunch of things that these companies have to be able to do before they can launch. They have to guarantee, traceability, et cetera, and it seems in principle possible. So much is possible technically to do that it seems entirely possible to reconcile these things. But I'm afraid I can't resolve that debate. It is a huge ongoing debate certainly in Europe, not so much in the United States. In the United States, it's all about the race to AGI, and so many of the resources are being devoted to that, to achieving this super intelligent model. But in the meantime, there's all this other stuff going on, and that's what we're trying to kind of draw attention to. Yeah, red in the back.
Hello, thank you. It was really mind-blowing. My question is once again about regulation in Europe. So I appreciated very much your matrix on supply side and the demand side and explaining the difference across the three continents. I was just wondering if in terms of regulatory context, the regulatory context that has to do not with GDPR, so Data Protection or Digital Services Act or Digital Market Act, but rather with competition, antitrust, anti-monopoly law, didn't have more weight in this context to explain the differences. And on the other side, I was thinking that one of the replies that Europe is looking for at the moment is this new Industrial Accelerator Act, which includes a Made in Europe clause. Now, it doesn't apply yet to digital services. It's mainly thought to reduce the imports of electric cars from China. But in principle, it's something that establishes that for all public procurement, at least a certain percentage of something needs to be built in Europe. Is another side of the coin of the response of trying to find a regulation that has nothing to do with the content, the sectoral content of the business, but the regulatory environment as such. So I wanted to have your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So antitrust, I think, has played a big role here because, you know, these funny relationships that I was talking about, these kind of semi-modular and all these kind of complicated financial relationships, that's something that is, you know, the American antitrust regime is very forbearing on all kinds of matters of what's called vertical restraints. And so it's kind of that, all of that it has really allowed these firms to create all of these kind of interdependencies and sort of they're totally imbricated with one another, partly because of American antitrust. Whereas in Europe, I mean, what is happening, and this is very consistent with the kind of very different European approach to antitrust, which is much stricter on abuse of dominance. So that this is they're much stricter when it comes to trying to make sure that big companies do not become too powerful, and this is why you have these big cases against American companies, and often bigger fines against American companies. And at the same time, European antitrust has often been much more forbearing in terms of allowing for more coordination among less powerful actors. All of that in the United States would be coded as collusion and it would be illegal. But there's a lot of collaboration, and the sorts of collaboration that I was talking about are all very much within the context of European antitrust that is more forbearing on that kind of stuff. The kind of ordo-liberal, as they call it, the sort of ordo-liberal tradition of antitrust that's kind of came from Germany, but it sort of represents U.S. European approach to antitrust. Having said that, I will say that they have begun to relax some of these regulations, things like state aid. The rules governing state aid have been relaxed, partly because they do want to promote local champions or local competitors. And I believe that they have relaxed other aspects of antitrust as well. So that I think the competition with the U.S. and the worries about the U.S. For good reason have prompted them to start to rethink the regulatory framework. And the question is, like, how far or how deep does that go? And what you're seeing, I think what you point to about this, I mean, I do think that it's very interesting that what's going on in Europe is very targeted toward industries, right? This is very varieties of capitalism to me, because it's like in the US, it's all about radical innovation, and you get these radical innovators, and they are the ones that are diffusing this model. In Europe, this whole process is really organized around incumbent industries. Like in Germany, it's all about automobiles, and to a certain extent, pharma. And these are legacy industries. If you look at Germany's export profile, for as far back as you can go, it's all about cars. And so basically they're channeling a lot of their efforts into creating sort of industry-specific, you know, models, both frontier models, but also industry-specific cloud solutions. And like whether or not they can do that, I mean, they are doing that. They're trying to do that. They've so far put a lot of effort into training models specific to particular industries, but the running of the model So there's this difference between training a model and then inference, and running inference is like basically running the model. All of that is still happening on these American cloud providers. So to the extent that Europe has been developing truly independent capacities, it's been heavily focused on training, but training with specific industries in mind, pharma, automobiles, like the traditional industries. And so for me, that's like a very varieties of capitalism. Honestly, that's where that last slide is. I put it there at the very end because it was I probably should start earlier with a varieties of capitalism framing for this whole thing, because that's where we kind of wound up. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for the talk. I'm a PhD student from the law school, and I've been thinking about antitrust and data center infrastructure in the global south. So this was and the last question was a very great to listen. So I have two questions. First on antitrust, and I think you've already addressed a little bit. So as you mentioned that, and there's probably a story about how American antitrust is letting all this collusion happening. And some antitrust scholars have written about Stargate, the collaboration between OpenAI and Oracle, and everyone could be argued to be illegal under US antitrust law, but probably not likely. But do you think this is similar to what is happening in Europe? I think, could we compare like the Stargate collaboration and the ones you mentioned about Eurostack, and maybe antitrust will play a role in that? So maybe if Stargate goes into Europe, it might be declared illegal under European antitrust, whereas their own national champions collaborating in the similar coordination might be might work for them. So that's like a more of a twist. Well, I'm not sure about weaponization, but a twist in antitrust. That's like one case. But then also on the comparative side, I think the DMA is also going into the cloud market, and I'm looking at the Japanese market where they also do the raid on Microsoft. So it's very interesting, and I thought that maybe antitrust could be another distinct pattern, but I want to hear more about your thoughts apart from what you've already mentioned. The second one is on infrastructure. And I love your framing on the demand and supply. Would you think that for the rest of the world, global south, that it will be both weak in demand and weak in supply? I guess that's the first question. But, and this goes to the Chinese one. So I come from China, no, I come from Thailand, but it's interesting how in Thailand, both the US and the Chinese are promising to invest heavily in data infrastructure. And it was quite a puzzle to me why they want to invest in a country. But I think it's the story about industrial coordination that you mentioned in Europe. And it seems like big tech wants money or investment from other countries to use in these competition in the AI race. So it seems to be that Chinese might have a demand side, not just only from its own country, but for global South country. Of course, it's not a big money like Europe and US, but it seems like it's like a Chinese way of going broader and using their leverage on existing infrastructure in Southeast Asia or in Asia in general to kind of like fund it or add it to their demand. So that's how I see it. And lastly, this was just the news this morning. So during the Gulf War, AWS data center was attacked. So Huawei just tweeted this about how like single region dependency cloud is a thing of a past. So it seems like even Chinese data centers companies are saying that like, oh, you shouldn't be using only US data center because it might be a target of warfare, which may be only very small case in the Gulf right now, but it's an interesting development from the Chinese, how they're selling their data center around the world. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's super. I hadn't read that. I hadn't read that about AWS being targeted. But yeah, these are huge capital infrastructure projects. They're a huge source of vulnerability for geopolitical reasons, but also just because they can go down, like I said. And so most of the big companies actually are kind of diversified across a couple of different cloud providers just for redundancy purposes, although they're often doing different things with different cloud providers. On the Chinese question, I'm not sure I have too much. You probably know more about this than I do in terms of their investments and their investments elsewhere. But of course, this is a big source of you can develop all sorts of like dependencies through having somebody reliant on your infrastructure. And some of the most advanced chips. The architecture that you need in the data center is very specific to the chip, actually, and so you kind of get locked into particular chips. And this is one reason why, for example, NVIDIA. I was talking earlier about who's the coalition for data for real independence in Europe, and NVIDIA is all down for this because they know that that European cloud providers are going to buy their chips, and that's going to lock them into their infrastructure, their racks, their cooling systems, et cetera. So there are real dependencies and real knock-on effects once you buy into a particular piece of hardware, you're buying into an entire ecosystem. So the infrastructure of the global south, will it be weak demand and weak supply? I mean, it depends. My guess is that you would have these foreign cloud providers coming in and quote unquote teaching these legacy firms like how they can use the cloud, and then developing, cultivating them as clients, which is exactly what Deloitte does all through Africa, all through these other countries. And then I'm not sure I have too much more to add on antitrust. If you get me talking about antitrust, as Paul knows, I'll go on forever because I've written a bunch on antitrust. But basically, I think you're right that the character of antitrust in the U.S. has just really allowed these firms to develop these oligopolistic tendencies, and in Europe, sort of peddling against that has proved to be pretty difficult, and so and that's why China, their solution really has been to really cultivate a lot of competition, but that competition has also really, to the extent that it has been centered on price and sort of this lowest level of infrastructure as a service, that's also kind of kept them in that pattern of usage, which which has advantages, but it doesn't move you into the higher value added components of any product segment. And I have Marianne, yeah, and then Paul. Oh, okay, sure, yeah. I'll take those, Paul and.
Hi, thank you, Kathy. That was really wonderful. So I really appreciate the way that you describe how the cloud model also reorganizes politics. And you showed us this still unbelievable picture of the tech moguls, the Trump inauguration. But there's so much more to be said about this, right? And so we just heard, there's an emergent international politics of data centers, being sort of these military targets. And I was thinking that, in the US, there's not a day that passes without, some article about another community kicking out yet another data center, right? So the cloud has become really a political object, materially because it drains resources, natural resources, electricity, and so on, but also symbolically because sort of it becomes this emblem of sort of surveillance and automation and everything we don't want in our future. So I wanted to you to talk a little bit more about sort of this multidimensionality of the cloud as a political object. And then it's perhaps a small comment, but you kept using this word, sophisticated client firms who want to use the cloud. And every time you use that word sophisticated, I guess the residual Marxist in my reptilian brain sort of, just buzzed. Because, I'm wondering if all of this isn't about the cost of labor. Where labor is cheap and, there's a lesser need for firms to upscale. Where it is expensive and unionized, as it is in Europe and especially Germany, everyone is quote, and I quote you here, eager to take advantage of the firm. So that's the sophistication, right? The sophistication is and maybe I'm going on limb here, but that's perhaps one of the reasons why these big industrial players are so important in the European model, is because of so it's actually a link to your, much earlier work. Anyway, those are the questions.
Very quick, and it might just add on to your comment. Yeah, I was looking at your sheet here at the key actors, and I was wondering how you judge the role of the state in Europe, and especially like I'm a PhD student here from Germany, and kind of looking, of course, also at the developments of data centers and AI factories in the EU strategies. And what I see is a much, like a different form of collaboration between state and research and like smaller players, and a much higher coordination, but also closer communication in terms of development, and which might be completely different in Europe than in other like in your other roles. And just wondering like how you judge the role of the state as key actor.
So that was dazzling talk. And I hesitate to add anything else given the time, but I'm not going to hesitate enough. I'm going to add just something which I think connects to some of the recent comments. So I'm really comfortable with, it's usually the way that I think about political economy problems is like map out the interests, and particularly the economic interests, and figure out how they might align and what kind of coalitions would form. I wonder in this space, and now I'm thinking a little bit about like the Farrell and Newman book that you mentioned, Underground Empire. Like, to what extent do you think we're moving into a world where national security stuff is just, that is all going to be in play with all of this stuff? So like when we think about Europe and we think about how Europe is going to respond, like, do we start with the automobile industry in Germany, or do we start with the fact that NATO, whether NATO is dead or just, no longer viable, even if it kind of persists. Like, just that there are these fundamental changes taking place in geopolitics affecting national security and supranational security. And, my sense is that when those things are really in play, they often trump, no pun intended, that they often trump a lot of the kinds of dynamics that we would normally expect to see when we're trying to understand political economy.
Yeah, really quick for each of these. First, the contestation over the cloud. It is really the people now are realizing that these data centers are really not welcome. And there's a lot. I have a graduate student who's actually working on this about placement of these things. And for a long time they were promising. You even see on TV. I don't watch TV, but the streaming, AWS kind of advertising how many jobs they bring and stuff like this with their data centers. And it's just they bring jobs for like construction workers for a couple of months, and then it's just these sophisticated technicians. And there, I think you're quite right. I hadn't thought about this, but we really should lean into this point, because that also helps to explain why China, on the demand side, is less urgent and is less eager to develop these things. Because if you have a plentiful supply of cheap labor, then why on earth would you spend all these resources in order to move in this direction? But I think it is absolutely a key thing in these other cases, and I will totally lean into that. Thank you. And the role of the state. I mean, the state has been, and the EU and the state, they have been funding these projects. And so far, the one that seems to have gotten most off the ground are these kind of nano centers or nano clouds, which are very GPU, NVIDIA heavy, but they're mostly they're just training models, as opposed to all the inference, then all the actual use of those models is happening on the cloud. So what they haven't been able to do is so far there's still lots of initiatives, but what they haven't been able to do is agree on, like, what exactly are we doing. So each country has its own ideas about what they want to do, and so getting together at the European level has been really a very complicated thing. And then finally, just really briefly on this, I do think we have to do more on this geopolitical thing. I mean, for me, what's interesting is, this techno-nationalist alliance is really an alliance of, on the techno side, is really an alliance of convenience. It's very convenient for them. It's very lucrative for them to be tied to the Trump administration, basically. But at the end of the day, these are global companies. They really don't have a big interest in these kinds of geopolitical conflicts or this kind of turmoil. And so, the Anthropic thing is a tiny glimpse of some of that. But so far, it's just been the case that it's just so irresistible to work with the Department of Defense on these big contracts that is held together. But I think you're right. We should really think about how these geopolitical dynamics could actually pull that alliance apart somehow. But thank you very much for coming on late and staying late.